Before we dive into the more technical stuff, I want you to really understand that the Caro-Kann only works against e4. Alright, you have no idea how many people come here confused, wondering whether they can play this opening against other stuff like d4, c4, you name it. I'm sorry to break your dreams, just like Santa Claus, this does not exist. And in fact, the situation is pretty simple. You can compare this to salt and sugar. They both look very similar, but when you do the taste, you're gonna feel the difference. Or at least hopefully. So we're gonna start by looking onto the exchange variation after e4, c6, d4, d5. Now white goes for takes. And honestly, I do believe that this is the most crucial variation that you need to understand, and perhaps even the simplest when it comes to memorization. And the cherry on top of the cake is that with this, you're pretty much gonna be killing 6 birds with 1 stone. Now you're probably wondering, well, that must be a pretty heavy stone. Well, I really like your perspicacity, okay? Average 1000 elo player, very nice to meet you. I like your sense of humor. But I'm referring to moves like, let's say, the bishop to c4, hillbilly attack, or whatever you guys call this, d5, e5, pawn takes. What is this gonna be? It is just gonna be an improved version for black of the exchange, because the bishop is just out of the game. Okay, you cannot play hillbilly attack and tell me that this is something different, okay? You cannot put lipstick on a pig and then say it's pretty. So the same can be applied for moves like knight to f3, d5 takes, or knight to c3, d5 pawn takes. Put all of these into the same bucket after d4, d5, takes, learn this position, and you're pretty much gonna kill them all. Now, the way you wanna develop, it's pretty intuitive. Knights are supposed to go into their natural squares. We wanna get castle short, but remember, we don't wanna be locking in the bishop inside the pawn chain. So, before you do that, develop the light square bishop. Usually, we prefer g4 if that's available. If not, we may stick with bishop to f5. That works just fine as well. And then you want to be playing e6, bishop e7. Get castled, rook comes into the open file. Black is doing really well. Now, there's actually something even more interesting, and it's the last thing that I want to mention about this variation, because it may occur very often. After knight f3, we play knight c6, and now white goes for the pin. I want you to play bishop to g4. Let's say white castles, and we play e6. If you're around 1000 elo, there's a very common archetype of players that genuinely love to develop their bishops like this, as they are somehow about to take you down in somewhat of a karate fight. And with that, I'm referring to the move bishop to g5. But in fact, instead of getting, anxious and uncomfortable, what if I told you that black has a winning move? Instead of going bishop to e7 like most of the people would do, embracing this exchange and then getting like a normal position, how about we once in a while step up from mediocrity and we go for the counterattack with bishop takes on f3, eliminating the defender. So if they take our bishop, we take theirs. If they enter this carousel of forcing moves, taking our queen, we take their queen. If they take our bishop, we take their bishop. I don't know why I sound like that, but I can let you do the count. We are just having an extra piece. So, not too shabby, okay? Instead of the immediate blunder, white could play also the move h3, which is like really the main thing that I want you to remember about the exchange variation. Because after I spent hundreds of hours, perhaps even thousands, analyzing with a computer in these type of positions, I came to the conclusion that there are actually some patterns that, if you look in the right direction, you can easily get to the optimal solution. So you just need to pretty much figure out what kind of variation are you facing. And for each variation in this video, I'm gonna be explaining one simple rule to always deal with this move when they are attacking your bishop. So, when you are facing the exchange, if they either have bishop onto b5 or knight onto c3, we like to take on f3. You may be wondering, okay, I like this sort of simplified thinking, but I kind of want to test the fire with my own fingers. Well, Please don't do that, but if you really want to, you can slide it back. But then a move like g4 can really get you in trouble. King of bishop back, but then knight e5. This pawn push can get your bishop trapped. There's a lot of pressure going on onto the knight. Why would you even get yourself into such an uncomfortable position? Okay, computer may survive, but for someone that wanted to play the Caro-Kann against 1d4, I wouldn't really recommend you enter this. Now, if you're going back a little, after h3, take the knight. They're gonna be taking the queen, and we have this very simple development. Knight on f6, knight wherever, bishop e7. They do this, usually, we like to castle already, threatening the pawn, because remember, we have unpinned. In beginner's brain, they will usually forget about this, thinking that the pawn on d4 is somehow gonna be immortal. But okay, if they go rook d1 defending, just go rook c8, and very important, you wanna be using your pawns. There's like 2 things you wanna understand about the exchange. Make sure you have a safe king, then you just have risk-free pressure on the queen side because of this open file. But for that, we're going to be using the pawns, the minority attack. Push these, go knight a5, knight c4, and black is already slightly better. So from the most common variation that we have just looked at, we're going to be diving right into what I believe to be by far the most annoying thing that you can ever face if unprepared. And you probably already know that I'm talking about the fantasy variation, which you're going to be getting after the moves e4, c6, d4, d5, and now white simply defends pawn by pawn. And here we have the first crossroads, because technically speaking, every single move is able to equalize, more or less. Like de is fine, fianchetto is fine, queen b6 is also okay. However, I recommend you play pawn to e5. This is a pawn sacrifice, and it's actually connected with a pretty cunning idea. Against the most common move, according to the statistics, d takes on e5. I want you to really pay attention onto this diagonal that has been weakened when white played the move f3. So we're pretty much, in other words, exploiting them for playing the fantasy. You can start with either bishop to c5 or queen b6, and they will, once again, usually take. When this happens, I want you to play the queen, targeting the knight. Now, put yourself in white's shoes. Are you going to play knight h3, allowing bishop takes, giving you this weird pawn structure? I don't really think so. And in fact, most of the people would play the move knight e2, where I'd like to ask you to pause the video and try to find the little winning sequence for black, because you have no idea how common this thing actually really is. It even happens in games that are rated around like 1800 in rapid. This is absolutely insane. You have no idea. Black can go for the check. King has only 1 square, because black is gonna be getting a very fat checkmate. Now, the risk of this is that you're gonna be getting too excited and may tunnel vision this idea for the whole game. But before we move on to the other lines, I want to bring to your attention a very important detail. When you are playing e5, you are also opening up queen's path. So another very common mistake that the white players are making in this position, they just go c3, okay? Don't ask me why they're playing this move. I guess they just kind of like this weird pawn structure, you know? Just having every single one of their pawns like these, thinking they are defending the center. But if you're a good boy or girl, you can take on e4. And after pawn takes, they are very vulnerable to this check. You can have queen to h4. Hitting the king and the pawn. If the king moves, it's bad. If they play g3, it's bad after queen e4. With a ginormous fork. Pick up the rook onto the next move with a winning position. Now, does this mean that the fantasy is simply losing by force for white? No, that's actually not the case at all. In a nutshell, when white is going for the fantasy, what you need to understand is that the opening, objectively speaking, is pretty solid, but it is just very difficult to play, since with f3 you're just taking a lot of the natural moves away from, as I mentioned already, the knight. So from my experience, you're highly unlikely to deal with somebody below 1800 that actually understands how to play this, especially how to deal with our very tricky gambit. So moving on to another variation, we're gonna be inspecting the so-called classical, which starts after c6, d4, d5, and now white is playing the move knight to c3, simply defending their pawn with a knight. Here, I recommend you take, very important move. Otherwise, if you forget to do this and start with like knight f6, then white can push the pawn. This is a common beginner mistake, and you simply have no good square for the knight. Instead, do take. And after knight takes, according to the book, the best move objectively is bishop to f5. But in the same time, this can also be the worst move, just because this variation is super boring to play. Usually you have to remember a lot of theory just to force a perpetual, else you may immediately get checkmated, and against other inferior lines by white, it is just gonna be incredibly difficult to play it for a win. To the point where if you just start staring into your ceiling or looking onto an empty wall, you will have way more fun, and I'm like not even exaggerating. Therefore, I recommend you play the move knight f6. This is not only incredibly easy to play, because after knight takes on f6, pawn takes on f6, you literally don't need any theory. You just need to remember where every single piece belongs. Like for instance, let's have a look. Dark square bishop goes to d6. We always castle short. If possible, we play bishop g4. If that's not a thing, we go to f5, whatever. Knight always goes to d7 more or less. Rook goes onto the open file. You already know your following next 10 moves. Considering the fact that I don't remember what food I had yesterday, I think this is a pretty underrated strategy to have. But wait a second, because this gets even better. If you're playing this variation, you're actually set against another very critical response by white. Because in case they're going for the two knights, knight to c3 and then knight f3, you can still play d takes on e4 and hope for a Tartakower transposition after knight to f6. Because if they take, we take it back with a pawn, and they will most of the times play d4, and we're back into the normal things. Maybe Santa Claus does exist after all. So, just to give you a very brief introductory line, we play bishop to d6, and yeah, if bishop to d3, we're gonna castle, then we get the pin. Okay? Priorities. First, we castle, then we pin. And if white plays the move h3, whenever you have these double pawns, I recommend you step back with the bishop. Take that as the rule, do it all the time, and you're gonna be doing very well. Next up, you can continue with moves such as rook e8. Let's say white plays some random things. Knight always goes onto d7, and then it maneuvers itself to f8. Simply because the alternative knight to b6 was really bad. If you think that you're about to get knight d5 and then take the enemy bishop, think again, because they can play the move c4, saying no more knight d5, and if you're not careful, I'm about to play c5 and win a piece. Furthermore, leading to a rather passive position for black. So don't go knight b6, play knight f8 instead, and after that, make sure to follow it up with the key maneuver that you want to remember for this structure. We're going to be setting up the sniper. Bishop to c7. Preparing queen d6, and then you have ideas such as bishop takes on f3. If they take, you infiltrate with a queen, usually leading to a mating attack. So, I'm telling you, pals, it can't get harder than this. I actually meant to say easier. So, to sum things up, whenever you are playing this structure, make sure to avoid trades at all costs, because all the endgames are pretty nasty to play since white more or less has an extra pawn onto the queen side. Keep pieces on the board and just try to direct all of your forces towards the enemy king. And with that, we can move on to the last chapter of the video. So the most academical way of reaching the advance is after c6, d4, d5, and now white pushes the pawn. Here you have a choice, and you need to choose really wisely, especially as a beginner, because according to the book, the best thing that you can play is bishop to f5. But just in order to kind of experience with this and get a game, you need to be ready for a variety of moves like h4, g4, you need to know knight c3, knight f3. I can keep going, the list never ends, it's pretty much like you set up a first date with a girl. Let's say you grab drinks or something. But before the actual date, you need to get to know every single member of her family. I'm like, dude, I don't even know this is gonna be a thing. Isn't it possible to get the drinks without me getting to meet your uncle? So, for that reason, I don't want to commit. And I really like to play the move c5. Because after this, we're pretty much restraining white's option to like around 70% of the time, they're gonna be playing c3. And the other like 30%-ish, they're gonna be taking. So you very much know what you're paying for when you're going for this variation. Therefore, most of the times, white is gonna be playing the move c3, just setting up this huge pawn center. Every single one of these little boys defending each other, where I recommend you play the move knight to c6. No need to be afraid of dc5 because of knight e5. And mainly, they're going to be playing the move knight to f3, where I like you to take on d4, just because we're going to be fixing the weak pawn. We're going to be fixing a target. Simply because knight takes on d4 is not a thing, that would be dropping the pawn. And once this happens, here you pretty much get to see the main advantage of not having committed very early with a move bishop to f5, because you can get something even better. You can play bishop to g4, and we're not only developing the bishop, but we're also gaining time. We have massive pressure onto the knight, and it's like not really specifically the knight that's bothered, but more so the d4 pawn. You can take a look by yourself. The pawn is really lacking any support. In case they are very careless, playing h3, congrats, you just lost the pawn after takes, queen takes. This guy remains undefended, so black is just better. Usually, they are going to be playing a move such as bishop to e2. I recommend you play e6. Please, the whole time, remember that the main battlefield is the d4 pawn, so really keep an eye on this thing. And after castles, you just want to be playing the move knight e7, preparing knight f5. And once you get that, we will be having tremendous pressure onto the d4 pawn. If white tries to be sneaky and stop that with bishop to g5, you can simply unpin, go queen b6, creating a double attack, and also just getting ready to play knight onto f5 onto the next move. Black is already better. Instead, the more normal knight c3 is going to be met by knight f5, creating a threat of bishop takes on f3, and then the pawn remains undefended, pretty much forcing white in playing bishop to e3, where I want you to not play bishop to b4, okay? Like, way too many people go bishop to b4 thinking they get a trade, but at the end of the day, that is simply going to be strengthening white's pawn center. Therefore, I want you to stick with the more humble bishop to e7. Also, please make sure to delay knight takes on e3 for as long as you can. This is not the most active bishop ever, and that would simply improve white's pawn structure. And the only time when we actually take on e3 is when the knight is getting pressured. So play bishop e7, and after h3, I want you to really remember this rule, because whenever you are dealing with the advanced variation, we are gonna be meeting h3 with bishop takes on f3. And this is like really logical, okay? We are getting rid of the knight because the knight is covering the main important square, d4. So we're pretty much weakening their control over that. And after bishop takes on f3, get castled, and you can continue with this type of moves, like get the rook onto c8, bishop goes to g5, push your pawns onto the queen side, you have knight a5, knight c4 ideas to maneuver, and black is already slightly better. Now, in the less likely scenario where they're gonna be meeting c5 by taking, you have a choice. According to the book, best move is e6, but I don't want to be locking in the bishop when we have alternatives, sometimes even at the cost of a pawn. So I'm a huge fan of knight c6, just because beginners don't really know how to react against this properly. And most of the times they're going to be playing something like knight f3, allowing bishop g4, and after bishop e2, e6. They have pretty much no way in really supporting that pawn onto c5. And not only that, we're winning back the pawn on c5, but notice that without the enemy pawn on d4, the comrade defending e5, this little guy is gonna become very weak. And already there's a threat of taking and picking up the pawn. So white can try bishop f4, defending. But here, please feel free to pause the video and try to find the little winning sequence that black has available. Because we can continue with bishop takes on f3. And the point is that we're gonna follow this up with bishop to d4, which is a very cunning double attack. You have no idea how many times you can get this opportunity. And no need to be afraid of the fact that, okay, you haven't castled. The position is completely safe after something like this. We're ready to castle. We can block any checks with a knight. So this is already just better. Last thing before we close the advanced chapter. We looked at it from the academical point of view. But a lot of your opponents are going to be very weird, okay? They may start with a move like knight f3 and then try to confuse you with e5. But essentially, this is going to lead to the same thing. If you do bishop g4, try e6, c5, knight c6. So they're probably going to do this, go e6, then c5, knight c6 with a transposition. Similarly, they can also play f4 onto the second move. And when the pawn reaches the e5 square, this should be a signal to you that we are dealing with the advance. So in the advance, we do c5, knight c6, wait for the knight so we can get the pin, and black just has a very easy game. So if this is any interesting to you, make sure to watch the video a couple of times. I did my best in ignoring all the kind of top level nonsense that never gets played below 1800 in online games. And if you wanna strengthen your knowledge even further, please feel free to check out the playlist that we have with practical games where I'm doing live play and explain, highlighting typical beginner mistakes that they usually are making.